My husband secretly removed my name from the house, so I made sure he lost everything. Rebecca had always believed that success and recognition went hand in hand, but that's not how her life unfolded. She built her own career from scratch, fought to understand the financial market, and, with intelligence and strategy, accumulated a respectable fortune. When she met Daniel, a charismatic and ambitious man, she saw in him a partner to grow even more. What she didn't realize at the time was that, in his eyes, she was never an equal, just a stepping stone to something greater. In the beginning, it seemed like a perfect marriage, an influential couple, a life of luxury, and a business partnership. But behind the smiles and expensive dinners, there was a truth she refused to see. She had always been the mind behind the investments, the person who found the right opportunities and knew where to allocate resources. However, when the contracts were signed, it was Daniel who received the praise. "You have an incredible knack for business," friends would say. "What extraordinary vision," investors commented. Rebecca listened in silence, convinced that what mattered was their joint growth. She thought that one day Daniel would recognize her importance, but that day never came. On the contrary, the more the company prospered, the more he reduced her to the role of a wife with an impeccable appearance, the woman who was lucky enough to be by the side of such a brilliant man. Meetings began to happen without her. Decisions were made without consulting her. And when she questioned it, Daniel would always smile and say, "Don't worry, love, I've got everything under control." Deep down, Rebecca knew something was wrong. But she chose to ignore the signs, believing that it was just part of the corporate game. Her mistake was trusting blindly. For years, she accepted being marginalized, being presented only as a supporter, never as the true person responsible for the empire's success. He was the face of the business, and she, just the shadow behind the throne. Time passed, and Rebecca got used to that dynamic. However, something inside her began to change. She started feeling that, little by little, she was disappearing. Her identity was dissolving in a relationship where she was merely a complement, not the protagonist. Friends and investors saw her only as Daniel Cole's wife, and not the brilliant financial strategist who had built that fortune. But it was only when the final blow came that she realized the true extent of the betrayal. On an ordinary night, after yet another event where Daniel monopolized the credits for a project she had designed, Rebecca felt a different kind of discomfort. It wasn't just frustration, but a premonition, as if something were wrong. She decided to check some old documents, contracts she had signed years before. But when she opened the files, she noticed something terrifying. Her name was no longer there. Rebecca read the documents over and over, refusing to believe what she saw. Her name had disappeared from several contracts, and in its place was only Daniel's. How was that possible? She had always signed every transaction, every acquisition, every investment. Her heart raced. Something was very wrong. Trying to stay calm, she grabbed her phone and called Nathan, the lawyer who had managed her finances before her marriage. He answered with a neutral tone, but when Rebecca explained what she had found, a long silence followed. Finally, he said, "We need to talk." In person. The meeting took place at Nathan's office the following morning. Rebecca arrived dressed as always, impeccable, elegant, the image of a woman in control. But inside, she felt broken. Nathan greeted her with a serious expression and an envelope on the table. "I received these documents a few months ago, all signed by you." He slid the paper toward her. Rebecca felt a chill when she saw her own signature at the bottom of the papers, but she had never signed that. Someone was forging her signature. The reality began to fit together like a cruel puzzle. While she trusted Daniel to handle the formalities, he was slowly removing her from his own fortune. But why? And why had he not said anything yet? Nathan, with years of experience in the corporate world, already knew the answer. "He's preparing your exit, Rebecca. A divorce that will leave you with nothing." Those words hit hard. Her husband, the man with whom she had built a life, who shared her bed and her routine, was scheming to discard her as if she had never existed. Anger bubbled within her, but along with it came something stronger, absolute clarity. Now, she saw everything with new eyes. The subtle changes in Daniel's behavior, the secret meetings, the business trips that never made sense, the excessive control over assets and bank accounts. All along, he had been planning this move. He didn't just want to leave the marriage. He wanted to leave with everything. Rebecca looked at Nathan, and for the first time in a long time, smiled. But it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the smile of someone who had just awakened to a new reality. If Daniel thought she would passively accept this fate, he was mistaken. He was about to find out that for years, he had underestimated the wrong person. Rebecca left Nathan's office with trembling hands, but her mind was cold and calculating. For years, she had allowed Daniel to set the rules of the game, trusting blindly in the man who claimed to love her. Now, that trust had turned into a trap, but she refused to be a victim. Not yet. Before acting, she needed concrete evidence. If Daniel was planning to leave her with nothing, she would do the same to him. Only first. Arriving home, Rebecca maintained her serene expression. Daniel was sitting on the couch, typing on his cell phone with a half smile. Perhaps he was talking to a lawyer, organizing the final details for her ruin. She approached him and kissed his cheek, as she always did, and he didn't even look up from the screen. That confirmed what she already knew. He believed she suspected nothing. Perfect. During the night, she waited until he was asleep, and silently entered Daniel's study. She knew he kept important documents in a locked drawer. Before, she had never questioned his need for secrecy. Now she knew that the secret was the key to his betrayal. She took a hairpin and, with unexpected patience, managed to open the lock. What she found inside was even worse than she had expected. Property transfer contracts, bank statements from accounts she had never known existed, emails exchanged with lawyers discussing the details of the divorce. Her stomach churned. He wasn't just removing her name from the assets. He had already started negotiations to sell them. In a few months, when she received the divorce papers, everything would be liquidated, and she would find herself without a house, without investments, without absolutely anything. Every detail had been meticulously planned. But Daniel made a fatal mistake. He never considered that Rebecca might be smarter than him. Slowly, she put the papers back in order in the same place. She left the study without a sound and closed the door behind her. Her heart pounded, but she felt no fear. She felt power. The game had turned. Daniel believed he was controlling everything, but from that moment on, Rebecca was the one pulling the strings. She just needed time to execute her plan. Rebecca spent the night awake, but not out of fear or despair. She was plotting her plan. For the first time in a long time, her mind worked with the clarity of someone who saw the whole game, not just the pieces Daniel allowed her to see. He thought she remained blind, but in reality, she was already 3 steps ahead. Now, every move she made would be carefully calculated. The next morning, when she went down for coffee, Rebecca found Daniel already dressed to go out. He smiled as if nothing were happening, as if he wasn't plotting to remove her from his own home. It was almost comical. She returned the smile and served coffee for both. "I've been thinking about learning more about investments," she commented casually, watching his reaction. Daniel, as predictable as ever, laughed condescendingly. "You don't need to worry about that, love. I've got everything under control." Exactly the response she wanted to hear. She spent the following days keeping up appearances, becoming the perfect wife in Daniel's eyes, affectionate, understanding, and disinterested in finances, all so that he continued to believe his plan was intact. But behind the scenes, Rebecca moved with precision. She asked Nathan to pull all the documents of the latest transactions made in Daniel's name. She also discreetly contacted a forensic signature specialist to prove the forgery in the papers that transferred their assets to her husband's name. The hardest part was controlling her emotions. Knowing that Daniel dined with her every night, slept beside her, and pretended that nothing was happening was like slowly swallowing poison. But every moment of pretense was worth it, because each day she gathered more information. She didn't just want to protect herself. She wanted to ensure that in the end, Daniel would be left empty-handed. Within a few weeks, she had everything she needed. Evidence of the forgery, records of hidden accounts, and, most importantly, a clear plan to turn the tables. Daniel had no idea. But while he was preparing to kick her out of his life, Rebecca had already begun dismantling his empire, piece by piece. Rebecca knew she couldn't simply confront Daniel. He was smart, manipulative, and had enough influence to try to overturn any accusation. No, she needed to be patient. Her plan required precision and time, and she was willing to wait for the right moment. The first action was to ensure she had access to her own resources. Discreetly, she began transferring small amounts to a separate account in the name of her financial consultancy, a business she kept under the radar, but which would now become her fortress. If Daniel planned to leave her with nothing, she would ensure that when the time came, he'd be the one left empty-handed. Every penny diverted imperceptibly would be a blow to his arrogance. The second step involved a subtle counterattack. While Daniel believed that she was still a passive bystander, Rebecca began contacting trusted investors and lawyers. Under a corporate name, she probed business opportunities and ensured that, when the moment arrived, she could act without her involvement being detected. She also created a shell holding company, protecting assets that Daniel thought he controlled. Meanwhile, Daniel continued living his farce. He left every morning confident, believing that everything was going according to plan. He talked about rebalancing investments and a major real estate acquisition that would bring massive profits. Rebecca feigned enthusiasm, asked naive questions, and he responded with that paternal tone, reinforcing his belief that she understood nothing of what was happening. But, in reality, every answer of his helped Rebecca prepare for the final move. The game now had new rules, and Daniel still didn't know that he was playing against someone who knew all his weaknesses. Rebecca observed and mentally noted every detail, waiting only for the right moment for checkmate. She didn't just want to win. She wanted him to watch as everything he thought he owned crumbled before his eyes. Daniel had always considered himself the smartest in the relationship. To him, Rebecca was just a decorative piece, a woman lucky enough to have married a successful man. In his mind, she would never suspect a thing, much less be capable of contesting his decisions. That was the mistake that sealed his fate. Rebecca realized that his confidence in her ignorance was his greatest advantage. While he continued with his normal routine, she observed, every scheduled meeting, every late-night call, every document left on the table, everything became a clue. With patience and strategy, she began mapping all of Daniel's financial moves. What had once been a game of illusion now turned into a board where she moved the pieces without him noticing. His plan was simple. When the divorce papers were delivered, Rebecca would be left with nothing, and he would have all the properties, accounts, and investments. But what he didn't know was that she had already reversed part of the misappropriations and ensured that her own resources were secure. Moreover, with the help of Nathan and a forensic specialist, she already had enough evidence to question every fraudulent transaction he had made. With every new move, Rebecca grew stronger. She no longer felt fear or insecurity. She felt in control. Daniel continued believing that his wife was oblivious to everything, still the docile woman who trusted him blindly. But he failed to notice how predictable his responses were becoming, how Rebecca asked strategic questions, how every seemingly innocuous detail he shared was being used against him. His excessive confidence was his downfall. He thought he was in command, that he had absolute control of the situation. But the truth was that the game had already changed, and he was the only one who still didn't know. Rebecca knew that it wasn't enough to protect herself. She needed to act before Daniel realized something was wrong. If she waited too long, he might anticipate her moves and hinder her strategy. So, silently, she created a parallel plan, one that would ensure that when the time was right, Daniel would lose everything he had tried to steal. The first move was to formalize her financial consultancy, which until then had operated in the background. With the help of Nathan and a trusted accountant, she structured the company so that it could absorb Daniel's assets without raising suspicions. Her investments began to be reallocated, transferred to entities he couldn't trace. What was once a small business quickly transformed into a financial fortress, ready to expand at the exact moment. Meanwhile, Daniel still believed he was executing his plan without issues. He talked about his new real estate acquisition, a large enterprise that, according to him, would bring in millions. What he didn't know was that Rebecca had discovered that transaction and was already discreetly negotiating for the purchase to go through without his participation. With the help of Nathan and strategic investors, she became a direct competitor to her own husband, without him realizing. The second stage of the plan involved blocking Daniel's sources of capital. Knowing that he relied on loans and partnerships, Rebecca used her discreet influence to undermine his credibility in the market. Small insinuations here and there, investors being alerted about possible risks. Gradually, Daniel began to face unexpected obstacles. Banks questioned his guarantees, investors hesitated, and his businesses started to slow down. The game was set. Rebecca was now not just a victim trying to save herself. She was the strategist moving the pieces before Daniel even knew he was about to lose. He thought he was in control, but in reality, the control had already changed hands. The turning point was near, and when he finally realized it, it would be too late. Daniel was about to conclude his final move, the purchase of a high-value commercial building, which would further consolidate his position in the market. The deal was essential for him, for besides the prestige, the financial return would secure the funds necessary to continue expanding his investments, and of course, to exit the marriage without losing anything. He already envisioned his future without Rebecca, living comfortably and without any financial worries. What he didn't know was that Rebecca had already anticipated him. As soon as she discovered Daniel's intention to acquire the property, she acted quickly. Using her newly formalized consultancy, she made a better and safer offer to the seller. Her proposal offered more stable guarantees, without the financial risks that Daniel presented, and was received with much more confidence. While Daniel thought he was securing his financial safety, Rebecca had already wrested that possibility from his hands. When Daniel received the call informing him that his deal had been canceled in favor of another buyer, he was furious. Someone had interfered. Someone had made a stronger move. He spent hours trying to understand what had happened, calling contacts and trying to reverse the decision. But the answer was always the same. The other investor's offer was better. And the worst, no one wanted to say who was behind that negotiation. Rebecca maintained her discretion, avoiding any behavior that could raise suspicions. At dinner that night, Daniel was restless, irritated, but tried to hide it. "It seems someone pulled a fast one on me with a big deal today," he commented while sipping his wine. Rebecca raised her eyes, feigning surprise. "Really? What kind of deal?" He sighed, frustrated. "Nothing you need to worry about." She smiled inwardly. He had no idea that the woman sitting across from him was the one responsible for his defeat. That transaction was the first major blow to Daniel's empire. He still didn't know, but he was about to lose much more than a building. With every new move, Rebecca made sure that when he finally realized the truth, there would be nothing left for him to save. Rebecca knew that attacking Daniel solely in the real estate market wouldn't be enough. He still had hidden money, secret resources that would ensure his survival, even if his main transactions were compromised. If she wanted to dismantle him completely, she needed to expose those secret funds. With the help of Nathan and a financial specialist, Rebecca began tracking the accounts Daniel kept off the radar. She had already found evidence of dubious transfers, but now she wanted concrete proof of offshore accounts and investments he had never mentioned. Through meticulous auditing, they discovered something even worse than they imagined. Daniel had diverted money from his own projects, reallocating millions to international accounts under the names of shell companies. That meant that, besides trying to remove Rebecca from the picture, he was also deceiving investors and financial partners. If this came to light, Daniel wouldn't just lose money. He would lose his reputation and could face serious investigations. This was the kind of information that could bring an empire crashing down overnight. Rebecca didn't reveal her cards immediately. She wanted Daniel to continue believing he was safe. At the same time, she began sending anonymous reports to banks and regulatory agencies, raising suspicions about his financial moves. Gradually, Daniel began to feel the weight of financial difficulties. Verification requests were sent to his banks, transactions were blocked, and business partners started to hesitate. But the final blow would come from where he least expected it. While he was still trying to understand why his credibility was being questioned, Rebecca was preparing the definitive attack, a move that would ensure he would never again be able to manipulate his money or his name. The financial war was just beginning, and Daniel still didn't know he was already defeated. Daniel had always trusted his public image to keep his businesses prosperous. Being a respectable businessman was his greatest asset, and he knew it. But with the recent bank freezes and suspicions about his financial transactions, what had once been a solid empire was about to crumble. The first signs came subtly. An investor who had always shown interest in his projects suddenly postponed a meeting. A transaction that should have been approved without problems was placed under bank scrutiny. Small delays and refusals began to accumulate, and Daniel couldn't understand why. He still thought he had control over everything. But Rebecca knew that that was the beginning of the end. Then came the most devastating blow. Longtime partners began to distance themselves. Rumors circulated in the market that something was wrong with Daniel's finances. Some suspected fraud, others feared an imminent financial collapse. What no one knew was that Rebecca was discreetly fueling these doubts. She sent strategic information to influential people, just enough to make Daniel appear as an investment risk. The great humiliation came during a real estate industry event. In the past, Daniel had been the center of attention at these gatherings. But this time, when he tried to approach one of his biggest investors, he was met with a cold handshake and a vague excuse. Other partners averted their eyes, avoided long conversations, as if he carried a problem no one wanted to associate with their own name. For the first time, Daniel realized that something was wrong. Very wrong. That night, he arrived home frustrated, irritated. Rebecca, keeping up the facade, asked if he was okay. He sighed, massaging his temples. Something is happening, but I still don't know what. People are doubting me, but I'll fix it. Rebecca only nodded, hiding her smile behind the cup of tea she held. He still didn't know that the real problem was sitting right in front of him. In the following days, Daniel tried to figure out what was going on. He re-examined contracts, spoke with lawyers, sought explanations at the banks, but the more he investigated, the more he realized that his influence was fading. What used to be solved with a simple phone call now required clarifications, revisions, additional signatures. Something was slipping from his grasp, and he didn't know where the attack was coming from. Then Rebecca decided that it was the right time for her final move. That night, when Daniel arrived home, exhausted and irritated, she was waiting for him in the living room with a stack of documents on the table. The papers he thought he had hidden from her were all there, organized in chronological order. Offshore accounts, forged contracts, correspondence between him and his lawyers about the impending divorce. Every detail of the betrayal exposed. He froze upon seeing them. "What is this?" he asked, trying to keep his calm, but his voice already betrayed panic. Rebecca picked up one of the contracts and held it aloft. "Can you explain to me why my name was removed from all our properties without my knowledge?" The silence was absolute. For the first time, Daniel didn't have a ready answer. She stood up and walked slowly toward him. "You thought I'd never find out, didn't you?" Her tone was calm, but as sharp as a blade. Daniel looked at the papers and then at her, trying to regain control. "This is a misunderstanding, Rebecca. I was only reorganizing the finances, making sure everything was secure." But the lie sounded weak, pathetic. He knew she wouldn't believe him. Rebecca smiled, but there was something cold in her gaze. "Secure for whom?" Then, without raising her voice or showing anger, she said exactly what he feared most. "I've already reversed everything." Daniel's eyes widened. That was the first time he realized he wasn't dealing with the naive woman he thought he could fool. Daniel was still trying to process Rebecca's words when she picked up another document from the table and shoved it toward him. "Do you know what else I discovered?" she asked, her voice unhurried, without anger, just the tone of someone who had already won. He took the paper and, upon reading the first few lines, his face paled. It was the deed to the house. "You tried to remove my name from here as well, didn't you?" Rebecca folded her arms, watching every micro-expression on Daniel's face. "The problem is that there was an error at the registry office. A technical glitch. The document was never formalized. Legally, the house is still in my name." Daniel looked up at her, incredulous. That can't be true, but it was. And she knew he understood what that meant. The tension in the room became palpable. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "Rebecca, let's talk. You don't need to do this. We can resolve it together." But the tone in his voice was not one of pleading. It was desperation. He wasn't asking to save the marriage. He was trying to save himself. She walked to the door and opened it. The message was clear. "I've already settled it, Daniel." He stood motionless for a few seconds, as if trying to calculate some escape, some argument that could reverse the situation. But there was something in Rebecca's eyes that he had never seen before. a steadfast firmness. He lost. Daniel picked up the contract again and crumpled it between his fingers, but he knew there was nothing more he could do. He looked around the house he thought was his, and realized that night, he no longer had a place there. Without saying another word, he grabbed his keys and left. Rebecca closed the door behind him with the calm assurance of someone who knew that chapter was officially over. Daniel left the house that night aimlessly, but with one certainty: he needed to regain control. Yet the next day, when he tried to access his bank accounts, he found something he never expected. His assets were frozen. Every transaction was blocked by order of financial authorities, and any attempt to transfer funds was under review. He rushed to the bank, trying to understand what was happening. But as soon as he sat down in front of the manager, he realized the problem. "Mr. Cole, we are conducting an investigation into irregular transactions in your accounts. There are some transfers that need to be clarified before we can release any funds." Daniel tried to argue, but he no longer had any power there. He was surrounded. Meanwhile, Rebecca watched everything unfold from afar, with the serenity of someone who already knew the outcome. With Nathan's help, she had initiated an official audit of Daniel's finances. Every secret account, every suspicious transfer, every attempt to hide money had been documented and sent for review. He wasn't just losing money. He was becoming the target of a possible formal investigation. The worst blow came when his investors started demanding explanations. With rumors circulating and his assets frozen, no one trusted him anymore. Those who had once been willing to invest millions in his projects now wanted guarantees he couldn't offer. Contracts began to be canceled. He could no longer secure loans. The empire he had built, the empire that had stolen from Rebecca, was crumbling. With no options left, Daniel picked up the phone and dialed Rebecca's number. The call went straight to voicemail. She had nothing more to say to him. He had made his choices. Now, he was paying the price. Daniel had always believed that his reputation was unassailable. To him, the contacts he had cultivated over the years were enough to protect him from any crisis. But as news of his financial maneuvers spread, his name went from respected to an imminent risk. The first major loss came with a phone call. One of his biggest investors, who had promised millions for a new venture, decided to cancel the contract. The justification was cold and direct. "We cannot risk being associated with you at this time." And that was just the beginning. Other investors followed the same path, breaking contracts, withdrawing their stakes, and distancing themselves as much as possible. Daniel realized he was alone. The allies who had flattered him in times of success now wouldn't even answer his calls. Even his lawyers began suggesting that he reduce his public exposure to avoid a bigger scandal. In a matter of weeks, he went from a promising businessman to a man whose businesses were crumbling before his eyes. Rebecca, on the other hand, watched everything happen with a mix of satisfaction and relief. She didn't need to do anything more. Daniel was destroying himself. His financial collapse wasn't just the consequence of his betrayal against her, but of the arrogance of thinking he could build everything on lies and manipulation. The company he was so proud to call his empire was quietly dissolved. With no money, no credibility, and no allies, Daniel was officially bankrupt. For the first time, he was tasting his own venom, and now there was no one left to save him. While Daniel unsuccessfully tried to rebuild his reputation, Rebecca was busy ensuring that her new phase would be even greater than anything she had ever achieved before. She didn't just want to overcome the past. She wanted to build something that was entirely hers, without shadows, without manipulations, without betrayals. What began as a small side business had now become an established investment consultancy. With the assets she managed to salvage before Daniel could take them, she strengthened her company and attracted partners who trusted her. Unlike Daniel, Rebecca didn't need appearances or false contacts. She had competence and vision. The irony was that the very same investors who had once ignored her, treating her merely as Daniel Cole's wife, now wanted meetings with her. The market had changed direction. Daniel was a tarnished name, while Rebecca was seen as the woman who knew how to rise again. She proved that she had always been the true mastermind behind the success. One night, while reviewing some contracts, she noticed a curious detail. One of the companies that used to finance Daniel now wanted to work with her. The same circle he used to empower himself now recognized that the true leader had been there all along. She had become the person Daniel had always pretended to be. But the greatest victory of all wasn't financial. It was personal. Rebecca finally saw herself free. Free from manipulation. Free from needing to prove her worth to someone who had never truly seen her. Now she only looked forward. Her future was intact. Her past buried. While Rebecca prospered, Daniel faced the consequences of his own choices. Without investments, without credibility, and without assets, he found himself forced to accept the harsh reality. He was finished. The doors that once opened with a simple handshake were now closed. No bank wanted to lend money to someone under investigation. No reliable investor wanted to be associated with a name that now carried suspicions of fraud and manipulation. He tried to start over, but no one forgets such a public failure. With no way out, Daniel was forced to sell what was left of his luxurious life. The imported car, the watches, the last valuable possessions. Everything was liquidated to pay off debts and try to stay afloat. But it wasn't enough. The man who once flaunted wealth and influence now lived on odd jobs and favors from former acquaintances who still pitied him. Rebecca heard rumors about him. They said he had moved to a smaller town trying to rebuild a career in a market that still didn't know his story. But she didn't care. He was no longer a part of her life. His fate was no longer her problem. The only thing that remained was the irony of it all. He had planned to take everything from her, but he ended up with nothing. And the greatest lesson for Daniel wasn't the loss of money, but the fact that, in the end, he had never been as indispensable as he believed. The world of business had always been ruthless. A name can be exalted one day and forgotten the next. That was exactly what happened to Daniel. Once, he was seen as a promising investor. Now, his name became synonymous with failure. But on the other side, Rebecca emerged as one of the most respected businesswomen in the market. The transition was almost natural. The same investors who had once aligned with Daniel now wanted to understand how Rebecca had managed to turn the tables so strategically. Some tried to pretend, acting as if they had always supported her vision. But Rebecca knew the truth. Those very people had underestimated her abilities for years. She harbored no bitterness, but she also didn't do favors. Every partnership she accepted was carefully scrutinized, and every proposal was reviewed with a clinical eye. If she had once been seen as the wife behind the businessman, now she was recognized as a strategist who knew how to win without playing dirty. The greatest proof of that change came when one of the largest companies in the sector invited Rebecca to be a speaker at an event that, years ago, was led by Daniel. The market not only accepted her leadership now, it depended on her. She didn't take Daniel's place. She created one that was entirely her own. In the end, the corporate world had no room for those who lived on appearances and manipulation. Real strength lay in competence. And that was what now defined Rebecca. She won because she had always been the smartest. All it took was for the world to realize it. One day, while reviewing documents in her office, Rebecca received an unexpected message from her assistant. Kyle Wilson wanted a meeting. He, who had once been one of Daniel's biggest allies, was now trying to get close, curious. Kyle had been one of the first to distance himself when Daniel began to crumble. He had always had a keen sense for identifying who was rising and who was falling in the market. Now he saw in Rebecca an opportunity, a strong, established name that could bolster his own business. When he entered the room, he tried to act naturally, as if he had always respected her. "Rebecca, I always knew you were smart, but I must admit I'm impressed with everything you've built." She smiled politely. She knew the game he was playing. He presented a partnership proposal, praising her vision and strategic capacity. But Rebecca didn't need empty compliments. She listened patiently, analyzed the offer, and then calmly replied, "I'll think about it." Kyle didn't realize, but at that moment she had already made her decision. When he left, Rebecca looked out at the panoramic view from her office. In the past, she might have felt validated by that kind of recognition. But now, she knew she didn't need anyone's validation. She was respected because she made herself respected. And she didn't need the approval of former rivals to know that. Rebecca was no longer the same woman who once lived in Daniel's shadow. She had rebuilt her identity, her career, and above all, her confidence. Now, every decision was hers, Every achievement came on her own merit. She finally belonged to herself. Over time, she made profound changes, not only in her company, but also in her personal life. She sold the house where she had lived with Daniel and bought a new space, one that reflected her true personality. She renovated her office, redesigned her routine, and cut the last ties that still bound her to the past. There were days when she wondered if all of it had really happened, if the man who had once been by her side had truly planned to destroy her. But the evidence was there. The documents, the hidden transactions, the forged conversations. The betrayal was real, but so was her overcoming it. She stopped searching for answers about what Daniel had done. Some people simply choose the path of greed and lies, but that didn't mean she had to carry that weight. Her focus now was the future, a future she built herself. And for the first time in years, when she looked in the mirror, she recognized herself. Rebecca Chen, the woman many had underestimated, the woman who rose again. She smiled, knowing that this was only the first page of a new chapter. Time passed, and Daniel Cole's name disappeared from influential circles. He became merely a memory, a cautionary tale about what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. Meanwhile, Rebecca continued to grow. Her company expanded, new investors trusted her, and her reputation solidified. The world finally recognized who she had always been. One night, while watching the sunset from her new apartment, she received a notification on her phone. It was an article about Daniel Cole's decline. He was trying to restart, away from the spotlight, taking small jobs at companies that would never have hired him before. Rebecca opened the article, read a few lines, and then turned off her phone. It no longer mattered. Fate had already done its work. What mattered now was the life she had built, without needing to prove anything to anyone, without needing to hide, without dimming her shine so that another man could feel big. She had overcome not only Daniel, but also the old version of herself, the one who believed she needed others' validation to be strong. While taking a sip of wine, she thought about everything that had happened. His plan was perfect, except for one detail. He never imagined that the woman he tried to erase would become the greatest threat to his very existence. But now, it didn't matter anymore. She had won. Not because she destroyed Daniel, but because she rebuilt herself. And it was in that moment of silence and peace that Rebecca understood. The best kind of revenge isn't to destroy someone. It's to show that you never needed them to win. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs this message of strength and overcoming. Subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and resilience. Join our community to be moved by real accounts of transformation.